Umineko. Wow. Can't even remember where we left it. There was a knock on the door and Genji-san entered. Oh, I remember. Oh.
お食事はまたこちらでよろしいですか？
ええ、ここへ運ばせなさい。南條先生はまだ厨房にいるのですか？
はい。次の一手を熟考したいとおっしゃっております。ご安心を。他の使用人たちとご一緒です。
I do not think Natsuhi is worried about Nanjo. I'm sorry to put that one out there.
源氏さんはじい様の相手ができるくらいチェスが強いもんな。南條先生よりも強いらしいぜ。
そうなんだ。昔相手をしてもらったことがあるけど、あれは勝たせてくれたのかな。
マリア、もうすぐ飯だそうだぜ。しかし、よく一日中テレビを見ていて飽きねえな。
いつもテレビいっぱい見てるから平気。
マリアちゃんはテレビっ子なんだね。
食事だから机の上を片付けないとダメだぜ。
Earlier we had torn several pages out of Maria's notebook, and there was now a mess where everyone had been drawing together. Jessica began cleaning up that quickly. Still, everyone here can really draw. Oh, really can draw. I'd never guessed.
源氏、エヴァさんたちにもせめて食事くらい一緒にしないかとお声をかけなさい。どうせ断るでしょうが。
かしこまりました。
かしこまりました。
お父様の次はエヴァさんですか。つくづく後宮家の食卓には全員が揃いませんね。
I'm sorry, would you want to eat where there's possibly a murderer? Hello? Natsuhi felt her headache start throbbing again and lightly held her temples. The distance from the kitchen to the parlour wasn't that great, so Genji had gone and come back by himself, but the guest room was a little farther away. Natsuhi had warned him to avoid being alone whenever possible, and just now Nanjo had also admonished him, saying it'd be better if he held a little more concern for his safety. Kanan accompanied Genji, and the two of them went to visit Eva and Hideyoshi in their guest room. Genji knocked on the door.
Eva-sama, Hideyoshi-sama, お夕食の準備が整いました。
He waited a short while for them to come out. There was no response.
源氏様、これは。
Kanan pointed under the door. A Western envelope had been inserted under it. Normally, when something was inserted this way, it'd be interpreted as a message from someone outside to someone in the room. So, since this might be a private note meant for Eva and Hideyoshi, it was not something that Kanan and Genji were supposed to take interest in. But this Western envelope was one of Kinzo's, the same kind as the one that Maria had taken out last night and surprised everyone with.
親方様の封筒だ。
あるいは。
Even though this was one of Kinzo's envelopes, the letter Maria read aloud the previous night hadn't come from Kinzo. Genji continued knocking a little harder and called out in a loud voice. Sorry, I'm just going to turn it up slightly. Slightly.
エヴァ様、エヴァ様、源氏でございます。いらっしゃいますか？
No.
お返事をお願いいたします。エヴァ様。
But there was no response from inside. Sometimes when the servants went to call some guests for a meal, the guests would be sleeping so deeply that they wouldn't wake up. In times like that, the servants would stick a letter in the door to show that it was time to come out and leave the guests be. But despite that, Genji beat even harder on the door and called out Eva's name. However, there was no answer. Kanan stuck his ear up to the door, held his breath, and listened for any sounds coming from inside.
テレビの音らしきものが。 でも気配が感じられません。お部屋は空っぽかも。
Genji took out a handkerchief and, careful not to touch it with his bare hands, gently pulled out the envelope that had been stuck under the door. It was sealed with deep red sealing wax. Without a doubt, the mark on that sealing wax had come from the Ushiromiya's family head ring.
Eva-sama! Eva-sama! どうかお返事を。もうお部屋にはいらっしゃいませんか?
I think that's the first time I've ever heard Genji sound panicked. But there was still no answer. There was a chance that those two were aimlessly walking around the mansion. This was the home Eva had grown up in. There was plenty of reason to think that she had gone out on a casual stroll. Genji groped around in his pocket and pulled out the bundle of keys which contained the key that would open the guest room. I've just realised the keyhole is upside down. Is that normal in Japan? Kanon also understood what this meant. They would sometimes unlock the door so that they could go in and do things like make the beds, but only after they made sure the guests were out. To unlock the door for any other reason, and especially to do so when there was a chance that the guests hadn't given permission and might still be in there, was an action unbecoming of a servant. But Genji had decided. If the only problem had been that his knock hadn't received a reply, he wouldn't have gone this far. But the envelope under the door was doubtlessly one of Kinzo's, or rather, one of the western envelopes of the Ushiromiya family head. After last night, the sender of this envelope could be somebody other than Kinzo. If this letter had been sent by somebody else... No. After giving that final notice, Genji stuck one of the keys from the bundle into the keyhole. There was the sound of the door unlocking, and after slowly turning the knob, he slowly started opening the door. Light seeped in through the crack of the door. Were they in the room? Or had they forgotten to turn out the lights? Clank. It was the sound of the door chain being pulled tight. The chain had been secured. The chain couldn't be secured from the outside, so it also proved that they were inside the room. The sound of voices on the TV seeped out of the room. The lights, the chain, and the TV, all of these things made it clear that they were inside the room. But there was no sign of them. Genji called out to Eva once again through the crack of the door, but there was no answer. As part of their job, the servants were able to unlock almost any lock in the mansion, but they had no way to open a door with a chain. The only way to get by the chain was to cut it. That was certainly not permitted as part of a servant's usual work. A creepy chill had already rushed up their backs. Kanon held his breath again and tried to sense someone through the door, but even so, he was not able to sense anyone. Hi! As Kanon hurried away to get a cutting tool, Genji called him to a stop. It looked like Kana was wondering why he had to do something so troublesome in the middle of this urgent situation. But Genji had said it out of wariness. He didn't care what happened to himself, but in the worst case scenario, he didn't want anything to happen to Kanon. In the kitchen, Kumasawa was piling food on a serving cart, and Nanjo was waiting for Genji, apparently wanting to show him a move he'd finally thought up that might turn the tables on him. But Genji's appearance immediately told him that something was wrong. What are you gonna do if he says no? Like, no, I don't want to suspend this chess game. Like, get over here and play this fucking game with me, bro.
何かあったんですか？
Maybe. Maybe not. Genji took Nanjo, who still didn't know what was going on, and quickly left the kitchen.
熊沢さん、申し訳ありませんが、僕と一緒に来てください。
何があったんですか、カノンさん。
Kumasawa said almost exactly the same thing as Nanjo, unable to take in the situation, and chased after Kanon, who had flown out into the hallway. Taking Kumasawa with him, Kanon went to a storage room and looked through the tools packed in toolboxes and hanging all over the walls, trying to find something that could be used to cut the chain.
何を探してるんですか？私も手伝いますよ。
ドアチェーンを切断するんです。大きめの番線カッターはどこだっけ？
ドアチェーンを？どうしてそんなことをするんですか？
エヴァ様たちのお部屋にチェーンが中にいらっしゃるはずなのに、お声をかけても返事がないんです。
It took Kumasawa some time to figure out how cutting the chain and even Hideyoshi not answering were connected, but she did realize that this was an urgent situation.
これなら多分。
Kanon took down a very large wire cutter that had been hanging on the wall. It was called a cutter, but maybe it'd be easier to understand if we said it was shaped like a large pair of pliers. Kanon remembered once being warned that this dangerous tool could easily cut through one of your fingers. Kanon took that and rushed up the stairs. He already knew instinctively he should fight for every minute, every second to open it quickly. Or perhaps it was already.
待ってください、カノンさん。
Come on, old woman, we don't have all fucking day. There's a murderer on the loose and two people who won't respond. Come on, you do the math, old lady. We ain't got time to waste. You can catch your breath when you're dead. Come on.
早く。
Kumasawa eventually caught up with him, gasping for breath with both hands on her knees. When Kanon changed his grip on the wire cutters and looked up at the door, he let out an struck speechless. Oh no. What this? I will have a screenshot of this sent to you from the anime.
何ですかこれは。
Kumasawa screamed weakly, her face pallid. That was no surprise, because right there, on the door, just like the magic circle that had been drawn on the shutter of the Rose Garden storehouse, there was another eerie shape drawn with blood-like paint. However, this would be odd to call one a magic circle, because unlike what most people would expect, it was not a circle with shapes drawn inside it, but a slightly more complicated geometrical shape. However, those strange characters filling the gaps which weren't from the alphabet were the same kind as the ones on that magic circle on the shutter. But the thing that had stuck Kanon struck speechless wasn't how eerie the magic circle was. It was that something like this hadn't been there a short while ago. First he had taken a trip back to the kitchen. After that, he'd gone to the storage room to grab a tool and headed right back. Put those together and it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. How could someone add something this creepy during that period of time? And as though it had just been drawn, almost like the door itself was bleeding, several unsettling vertical red lines slowly dripped down, getting longer and longer. Kumasawa's knees gave way and she sank down on the spot. If Kumasawa hadn't done this first, then Kanon surely would have wanted to.
ベアトリーチェ様。
ベアトリーチェ様の仕業ですよ。恐ろしや恐ろしや。
Kanon gulped, then readied the wire cutter and approached the door. He didn't want to get close to this disturbing magic circle, and he really didn't want to touch the steadily dripping substance that looked like blood. But if he didn't get close, he wouldn't be able to cut the chain. Fighting this cold feeling, he gulped again, and after gathering his courage, he went even closer, putting the wire cutter up against the chain. He then pressed with all his strength, managing to cut through the chain far more easily than he'd anticipated. The cut chain fell into 2 separate parts, which continued to clang as they swayed backwards and forwards.
カノンさん、足元に封筒が。しかもこれは親方様のもの。
It looked like Kumasawa had also noticed the western envelope at the bottom of the door. in that sealing wax that had been sealed with the head's ring. Cannon hesitated for just a second over whether he should open the letter first or check inside the room, but he eventually decided on fulfilling his original purpose. Cannon pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket. This was so he wouldn't leave fingerprints on the door. If his worst fears were realized, the police would want to investigate this room too. He slowly pushed the door open. He was able to more clearly hear the sound of the television, which had been seeping out faintly this whole time. Eva was lying face up on the bed. Insert CG here. On the bed with her shoes still on. Kumasawa, who had fearfully entered after Cannon and who was hiding behind his back, screamed a short eek again when she saw Eva like that. Eva's shoes had been the first part of her that Cannon had seen, so the oddness of wearing shoes in bed was the first thing to strike him. But when Eva's head shifted to his line of sight, Cannon couldn't help but let out a short scream like Kumasawa. Right in the middle of Eva's forehead, something had been placed? Something was growing there? No. Right in the center of her forehead was an old-fashioned knife. Was it an old-fashioned knife? Or was that some weapon like it was sticking out? At the base of where it was stuck in, blood dripped down, staining the sheets on the other side bright red. Kumasawa's knees gave way once more and she sank down onto the floor. Her mouth kept flapping open and closed, but she couldn't even scream. Eva was dead, with some kind of weapon sticking out of her forehead. Oh. There's the ping. We'll look at it in a minute. Because, remember, there should be one other person in this room. Both eyes were open wide, and the image of a person who killed her must have been burned into them. But the only mouth capable of naming that person had been shut for all eternity. Even though her forehead was the last place they wanted to look, they couldn't tear their eyes from it. Right there, the weapon was stuck into Eva's forehead, standing almost perfectly upright. And on the handle was a complicated design that you wouldn't expect to see on an ordinary weapon. That thing could be summed up with the word occult. It was a vulgar object with a design that might have been of some demon. Eva was on top of her bed, but the other bed was empty. Where was Hideyoshi? After taking a backwards glance at Kumasawa, still on her knees and stupefied, he checked the bathroom just in case. At the moment he opened the door, he was greeted by steam and the sound of the shower. Oh boy. Poor Hideyoshi. The bathroom was of the same familiar style as most hotel bathrooms. When taking a shower, a waterproof curtain was used to keep water from flying out. That waterproof curtain was half open, and lying, tumbled down in the bathtub was Hideyoshi completely naked with both eyes open, and pointing right at Cannon, just like Eva, a weapon with a demon-like design was stuck into his forehead. Let's have a little look. There you go. There's Hideyoshi over the side of the bathtub, flooding the bathtub. This fucking song. I'll have you know I am currently dancing in my fucking chair. Oh man, such a good song. Since his head had been under the shower's hot water this whole time, his face wasn't half covered and filthy with blood like Eva's had been. But the sight of him dead while still taking a shower was tragic enough. Yep, there's the second ping. Just then, they heard Natsuhi's voice coming from the hall. She was probably coming with Genji. As Natsuhi said that, she picked up the envelope. And before checking its contents, she entered the room herself where she found Eva, dead. Yes, just avert your eyes, because poor guy's like naked in the fucking shower. Give this man some dignity, my god.
これはむごいですな。
カナ、シャワーを止めてあげなさい。
Yeah, we're on a water meter. For fuck's sake, don't waste the water cannon.
気の毒にも程があります。
Cannon gripped his handkerchief and twisted the valve, turning off the shower. In the bathtub, a small jar of body soap had fallen with its cap off. It really looked like he'd been attacked while taking a shower. There was still a small splash of blood clinging to the white bathtub, and the combination of red and white made a horrible contrast.
わかった。市販は出とらんが。死後硬直も始まっとらん。おそらく殺されてから1時間経ったかどうかというところだろう。しかしこのような柄の短い凶器で頭蓋骨を考えられん。
Nanjo checked their pulse and their pupils, making certain of their deaths once more. As Cannon watched this businesslike treatment, he thought, couldn't you tell at a glance that they were dead without doing all that? Nanjo thought about removing the weapon, but then decided it'd be better to preserve the scene and hand it over to police, so he left it alone. But a close inspection of the base showed that it didn't have a blade. In fact, it was more conical than blade-shaped. He noticed that rather than a knife, it was more like a short-handled spear, something with a shape better suited for thrusting than slicing. Rather than a short spear, you might call it a thick ice pick. At any rate, after looking at this scene, no further words were needed to describe what sort of terrible purpose each eerily designed weapons were originally made for. Nor was it necessary to explain how they carried out their function. Natsuhi, hoping to escape the repulsive steam filling the bathroom as soon as she could, covered her mouth with a handkerchief and dashed from the room. Just viewing their gruesome bodies for an instant had been enough to burn the image into her eyes. If she looked any longer, that image would surely remain in her vision for all eternity. The rising urge to vomit was exactly the same feeling that she'd had this morning at the gardening storehouse. For a while, Natsuhi couldn't help but stand with her back facing the guest room, fighting that sickness in her stomach.
とにかくこの部屋を子供たちにジョージ君に見せるわけにはいきません。
George became Batman. He's Batman.
至急この部屋を閉じなさい。
見せられませんとも。
Is he not going to wonder where his parents are when suddenly he just never sees them again?
両親のこんなむごい姿をとてもジョージさんには。
But they could tell that those fiercely racing footsteps in the hallway belonged to George even before he came dashing into the room. George and the other children had been waiting in the parlour. However, when they saw Genji speak to Natsuhi, when they saw her turn pale and fly out the parlour, they'd felt a sense of foreboding. And when they saw a large group of people gathered around the guest room, they were sure of it.
父さん母さん
なんだよこれ。また魔法陣かよ。
Where's Mar? Oh, okay. She's here.
エヴァおばさんたちは無事なんだよな。おいカノ君、これは何の騒ぎなんだ。
Hannah didn't have to say anything. George's scream after he ran into the room told them everything they needed to know.
誰がこんなことを殺してやる殺してやる。
ジョージ君、しっかり。
Natsuhi touched George's shoulder with her hand, but he violently shook her off. George fell over beside her and buried his face in the bed in front of his mother's face, wailing. Then he pounded on the bed with his fist over and over again.
ジョージ兄さん。しっかり。バトラ。バトラ様。
Butler had his back against the wall of the hallway. and was covering his eyes with his right hand and weeping without restraint.
心に決めた女を婚約した次の日に失った。同じ日に親父とおふくろまで殺されるなんてよ。そんなのあんまりにも無謀じゃねえか。
I mean, you seem to forget you also have lost your parents, so... Of course, it's sad whenever anyone dies, no matter who it is. But to Butler, those left alone by the deaths of others were far more worthy of pity. Everyone here now had lost someone close to them. George wasn't the only one to be pitied. However, George's pain was far greater than everyone else's. I'm just enjoying the music, I'm so sorry, I'm just like up here dancing. Well, my mum is going to be getting home soon, so there'll probably be like a slight snip somewhere soon. But I'll splice together the next bit because this is not over. But right now, I'd like to look at the screen. This one. So, Eva was found first. Ushiromiya Eva, found on the bed of the guest room inside the mansion, with a weapon resembling an ice pick sticking out of her forehead. And there you can kind of see her. It's sticking out of her forehead. Ushiromiya Hideyoshi, found in the bathroom of the same guest room that Eva was found in. Like Eva, there was a weapon resembling an ice pick sticking out of his forehead. You can't see either of them by looking through the gap of the door while the train is set. You can't see them, so you can't reach them. Hayes, how could a human possibly kill them? How indeed, huh? How will we explain this one? Did someone have an elaborate trick? Was it the witch Beatrice? Who knows? So yes, George has now become Batman. I guess technically Mario is also Batman. And Battler is now Batman. I'd be very curious to know, after now the second Twilight has happened. Then let's take a look at... On the second Twilight, those who remain shall tear apart the two who are close. So, the two who were close were Eva and Hideyoshi, it would seem. Yeah. I wonder who the rest will be. Yeah, let's keep going. So, from the people... Hold on, characters. I would be very curious to know if your suspects have changed. Whether you've managed to narrow it down, whether it's given you any clarity, any answers per se. Whether it's made your mind up at all, I'd be very, very curious to know your very thoughts on this particular Twilight. I'd be very, very, very curious. Mario, I swear. Your mother is dead, Eva and Hideyoshi are dead, what the fuck? I mean, and Aunt Carrie and Uncle Rudolph and, you know, Shan and Gilda. Kraus. Does this child not feel emotion? Mario tried to comfort Battler in a mechanical-sounding voice. Battler violently wiped his tears.
くそ、もう悔し涙も悲しみの涙ももう二度と流さねえぜ。
全然頑張れ。
俺たちは魔女様に爪を食らってるわけだ。主勢一方ってわけだ。そりゃダメだぜ、全然ダメだ。チェス盤がひっくり返っちまうぜ。野郎は俺たち羊が明日まで逃げる手段もなく怯えてるだけだろうと思ってるだろうよ。だからひっくり返すぜ。明日までこの島から逃げられねえのは野郎も同じだ。しょんべんちびりそうになりながら逃げ隠れするのは俺たちじゃねえ。暴いてやるぜ、必ずだ。明日までに。いや、明日なんか待たねえ。今夜中にその胸ぐらをつかみ上げてやる。
とにかくこの部屋は警察が来るまでこのままにして施錠します。いいですね。
Natsuki announced it as though she didn't care whether they agreed or not. If anyone had a right to object, it would have been George, but he looked as though he'd shed enough tears. George nodded slightly, still facing away from the others. And when he stood up, everyone else agreed too. Natsuki still hadn't opened that western envelope of the family head that she'd picked up. But now that they'd decided to leave this room, she decided to unseal it in the parlour, where everyone could watch. Snip, snip, snip! As soon as they walked out into the hallway to head back to the parlour, some of them immediately felt something out of place, or maybe sensed something strange.
答えよ。
マリアもわかるか。こりゃ何の匂いだよ。ひでえ匂いだぜ。
When everyone sniffed the air, they did notice a horrible burnt smell drifting through the hallway, one that none of them had smelt until then.
私ちょっと厨房を見てきます。火はちゃんと消したはずなんですよ。
After noticing a burnt smell, it was natural that Kumasawa, who had just been using the burner in the kitchen, suspected that her own slip-up had caused it. Kumasawa hastily dashed away.
カノン、熊沢と行きなさい。一人にさせないように。
はい。
After nodding at Genji's order, Kanon followed after her. He wasn't running, but as he followed her, he tried to search for the cause of the smell in other directions as well.
臭い。
これは確かに鼻が曲がりそうな匂いですね。しかし換気のために窓を開けてもいいものか。
Natsuhi was reluctant to open the windows in a situation where self-defense was so important.
換気扇を回させましょう。窓を開ける必要はないと思います。
ジョージの兄貴、話しかけても大丈夫かよ。
犯人を探す相談なら構わないよ。
It seemed that George had managed to climb out of the abyss of sorrow. All that filled his chest now was the quiet flame of hatred towards the culprit who had stolen the lives of the ones he loved and his beloved parents.
部屋にはチェーンがかかってた。さっき構造を見たが、とても外から細工できる代物じゃねえ。つまり完璧な密室だったってことだ。
そうなるね。バラ庭園の倉庫の時はシャッターの鍵を使用人室からこっそりと持ち出したのだろうとか、あるいは複製の鍵を持っていた可能性とか、いくつか方法が想像できた。でもチェーンは違う。チェーンは一般に浸透した施錠方法の中で最もシンプルに密室を構築できる。
チェーンだけは物理的に破壊しない限り外からはどうにもならないぜ。じゃあつまり犯人は扉からは出入りしなかったってことなのか。
こりゃ面白いや。つい数時間ほど前にも扉以外でどうやって部屋から出入りしたのかってみんなで騒いだ気がするぜ。
Back then, we were all losing our cool, wondering how Grandfather had disappeared from his room. The receipt Aunt Eva stuck in the door on a whim proved that the door had remained sealed, and since Aunt Natsuki was the only person to enter or exit during that time, she was under suspicion. Aunt Eva proposed a theory about how Aunt Natsuki might have thrown Grandfather out the window and left by the door herself. But this door is much simpler. It was sealed from the inside by the door chain. The window had also been locked from the inside and the bodies had been inside the room. This time it really had been, without exaggeration, a true closed room. That's right. If you include Grandfather's disappearance, 3 cases have occurred and all 3 times the door has been the point of interest. The first was the shutter. There was a key in the servant room, and if we assume someone knew about that, this really can't be called a closed room. The next was the door sealed by the receipt. However, Aunt Natsuki entered that room, so if Grandfather had left through the window or had been thrown out, she would have been able to lock the window before escaping. Or, like my theory, Grandfather could have hidden until the receipt was gone and left the room later. Basically, this door can be defeated with a handful of desperate tricks. In that sense, you really can't call this one a closed room either. And now we have the door sealed with the door chain. Finally, we had to give up. The window, the door, everything had been locked. It was a perfect closed room. The first hadn't been a closed room because everyone could be suspected. The second hadn't been a closed room because Aunt Natsuki could be suspected. But this time, no one can be suspected. This was a perfect closed room because the door chain formed a seal that blocked everyone equally well.
なら、犯人は室内に入らずに犯行に及んだ。部屋の外から何らかの方法で。
確かにチェーンである以上、人が通れるほどは開けなくても多少の隙間を開けることができる。ノックして顔を覗かせたところを襲うとか。いや、甘いか。
Yes, if whoever it was attacked them through the door, Eva wouldn't have been found in the bed, and Hideyoshi certainly wouldn't have been found in the bathtub.
甘いよな。エヴァおばさんの遺体が扉のすぐそばだったなら、それも考えたぜ。だが、エヴァおばさんは部屋の奥のベッドの上。しかも、秀吉おじさんはバスルームだった。チェーンの隙間からでは姿を見ることもできねえし、手を伸ばすこともできねえ。ちくしょう。
全然ダメだ。Sunny was tugging softly at my sleeve. It was Maria.
おお、
満足って何がだよ。
バトラは親族の誰かを疑うのが嫌だから、犯人はベアトリーチェであってほしいと願ったよ。だからベアトリーチェは叶えた。バトラが言った通り、絶対に人間には無理なことをして、バトラに魔女の存在を信じさせてくれた。なのにわがまま。
I tapped Maria, who was laughing unpleasantly, on the head with my fist.
ああ、叶えてくれてありがとうよ。今のはその礼と、不謹慎な時に笑ったことへの教育的指導だ。それより教えやがれ。エヴァおばさんたちの部屋の扉にも、また怪しげな落書きがされていた。あれもまた魔法陣なのか。
あれは特に覚えやすい特徴的な形なんだから、あのくらい知っててほしいね。
知らねえから花を持たせてやってんだ。ごちゃごちゃ言わねえで解説しろい。
バトラは暴力的だね。あんまり意地悪すると教えないよ。 のげんこつ男。あれは月の一の魔法陣だよ。
何の意味がある？その魔法陣のご利益は？書かれてるヘブライ語の意味は？
記されているのは旧約聖書詩編第107編の16節。主は聖堂の扉を破り、鉄の栓抜きを打ち破ってくださいました。魔法陣の効用は2つ。1つはいかなる方法によって閉ざされた扉でも開くことができる。
そりゃ便利な魔法だぜ。つまり魔法の力に頼らなきゃ開けぬ密室の扉っていう、もう一つの効用は、
開かぬ扉を八方塞がりの事態に見立て扉を開く。難解な事態の時に用いることで、それまで思いつきもしなかった解決策を与えてくれるんだよ。平たく言うと、観察力や洞察力、ひらめきや直感を授けてくれる。ベアトリーチェはバトラごとき人間風情に、この扉の開き方がわかるものかって挑発してるんだよ。
よーし、もう黙れご苦労。上等だぜ。その魔女の挑戦受けてや。
マリアちゃん、この世に魔女も悪魔も存在しない。父さんと母さんは誰かが殺した。それが僕のよく知る人間なのか知らない人間なのかはわからない。でもそのどちらであっても必ず人間なんだ。
しかしどうやって、せいぜい10センチ程度しか開かない扉の隙間からどうやったら室内の2人を。
それにしても耐え難い匂いです。一体何事なのですか？
Kanan and Kumasawa, who had gone on ahead, realized the smell wasn't coming from the kitchen, even before they arrived there. That was because they noticed an even thicker wave of stench rising up from the stairs leading to the basement, which they passed on their way at the kitchen.
ボイラー室。またボイラーの調子が悪いんでしょうか。
Those stairs led to the underground boiler room. The mansion's boiler was old and in poor condition. Both of them had witnessed problems with the boiler on several occasions. Fuck. But they never smelled the boiler belching out a stench like this before.
今の音は。
The thing they heard from the basement was definitely the sound of a door closing. Kumasawa had phrased it as a question, but she already knew it couldn't be anything else. Kumasawa was so surprised at the sound that her knees gave way yet again as she cowered. After all, at that very moment, nobody could have been in the boiler room. Just a few seconds ago, everyone had been crowded together around Ever and Hideyoshi's room. So who caused the sound of a door closing just now? After taking a second to sort out the situation, Kanon ran towards the basement. Since they'd heard the sound of a door closing just now, and there was no sign of anyone coming up the stairs, the person who'd closed the door had to be inside the boiler room just now. If the boiler room had been a dead end, Kanon wouldn't have rushed in so hastily. But Kanon was a servant, so he knew. There were two entrances to the boiler room, one that opened to the mansion, and one that opened to the courtyard. If he didn't chase them now, they might slip away. Kumasawa reached the same conclusion long after Kanon did. But she couldn't let him go alone. If the thing in the boiler room was the culprit, an opponent who had easily killed 6 adults in the first murder, then no matter how Kanon confronted them, he wouldn't be a match. Of course, with this argument, even if Kumasawa joined him, it wouldn't have changed anything. At any rate, after a delay, Kumasawa decided that she mustn't let Kanon go alone, and she rushed down the stairs. At that time, Kanon was already in the boiler room. The boiler room's characteristic damp heat tormented him. It had always been an unpleasantly smelly and hot place. And on top of that, the room was full of that horrible stench which made Kanon feel like he was going to be sick. There was no doubt that this room was the source. In that case, Cannon should have been searching for where the smell was coming from. However, Cannon kept gazing straight forward as he grabbed a hatchet from a tool shed shelf, just off to the side of the door. He hadn't stretched out his hand because he wanted a hatchet. He wanted to grab a weapon. Any weapon. Why? Cannon gazed into the darkness where the naked light bulb couldn't pierce. There, he answered.
ルーレットは数字と赤黒にかけて配当を競い合う。だが赤か黒かのようなリスクの低い賭けはその程度の配当しか与えられない。
The words coming from Cannon's mouth were swallowed up by the darkness. That darkness suddenly started to swirl, glittering. It was such a fantastical scene. Golden sparkling butterflies that hid in the shadows all over the boiler room flapped their wings, twinkling beautifully, and gathered in the darkness, disappearing. Cannon continued speaking, directing his words at the darkness as it swallowed up the butterflies. But as the butterflies gathered in the darkness, they they would certainly laugh. But Cannon continued to speak without faltering in the slightest.
逆により的中率の低いかけ方をすればそのリスクに比例した配当が与えられる。親方様は天文学的なリスクを的中できることを奇跡と呼び、その結果得られる天文学的な配当を魔法と呼んでいた。親方様とお前がどんな魔法を求めてルーレットに挑ん、しかしお前はルーレットには赤でも黒でもない目が出うることを忘れている。
Roulette has a special pocket called Zero, which means that the house takes everything in certain variants of the game. This means that all of the coins bet on the table will be swept up just as though everyone has forfeit.
僕は一つだけ心に決めていた。もしシャノンが殺されて僕が生き残るようなことがあったならこの身を投げ出してお前のルーレットを全て台無しにしてやろうと。これは親方様が決めたルールでもましてやお前が決めたルールでもない。このルールは僕が作った。僕はもう家具じゃない。お前のルーレットのゼロなんだ。
Cannon's face twisted with humiliation. It was clear that his defiance against his own weakness was being ridiculed somehow. Cannon's brows creased even further, and a fierce expression that he'd never shown to anyone appeared on his face. The hand grasping the hatchet was shaking. His sweat became drops, which slid downward. It was clear that the emotion causing Cannon's hand to shake wasn't just anger. However, Cannon suppressed that emotion.
僕はもうお前の言葉に惑わされたりはしない。悪魔のルーレットはこれでおしまいだ。地獄にてさらに1000年次の召喚者を待つがいい。ベアトリーチェ!
When Cannon raised the hatchet and tried to dive into the darkness definitely sneered. It sneered at that courage as if it were vulgar, lazy, futile, and meaningless. Cannon, his hatchet still held aloft, couldn't take another step after that. With a clang, the hatchet he had been grasping fell and rolled on the floor. And following that, with a pair of thuds, Cannon's knees hit, left and then right. That hand, which looked like it was trying to catch the sky, now that hatchet had been dropped, gradually lowered, landing on his chest. Then the other hand did the same. Right there, a handle with a demon-shaped design was buried into his chest. The same type of weapon that had been stabbed into Aunt Ava and Hideyoshi's foreheads was in Kanon's chest. Kanon was curled up in anguish, fresh blood dribbling from the corner of his mouth. It was makeup too extreme for Kanon's white skin. Around this scene, the glittering gold butterflies danced throughout the darkness, mesmerizing. It was a beautiful, beautiful dance, a funeral march of tribute, ridicule, and contempt for a single boy's self-sacrifice. Kanon had already been prepared for his own death. But although he could do nothing but accept the death that he had received, he attempted one last measure of resistance. He grasped the handle of the weapon sticking into his chest with both hands, and gritting his teeth with an acute, unearthly pain, he pulled it out. For only a moment, a bright red spray gushed out. It made an unpleasant bloop sound. It probably resembled the sound of Kanon's soul as it was sucked into the swamp of the dead.
Kanon-san?
Kumasawa screamed at the incomprehensible sight in front of her. Kanon was lying in a pool of blood. Kumasawa's heart was a complete mess. Ah, what a horrible fate. He wouldn't have been killed if I was with him. Ah, what incredible luck. If I had been with him, I might have been killed too. As she screamed, her expression was filled with complete confusion, and all of the muscles of her face were pulled up almost as though she was smiling while crying. But no one could have made fun of an expression like this. The first one to dash in was Natsuki, holding the rifle. Battler and Genji dashed in after her. Normally, they probably would have started discussing the origin of that violent stench filling the boiler room, but after they saw Kanon, who was lying on the ground as if he were drowning in an ocean of his own blood, the stench wasn't important anymore. Natsuki realized that even though Kanon was on the verge of death, he was still conscious, so she sent Genji to get the doctor. Natsuki, holding the rifle aloft, faced the darkness in the center of the boiler room and shouted, Battler, thinking quickly, took a large flashlight from the tool shelf alongside the door and used its light to cut through the darkness Natsuki was glaring into. But the light only shone on mechanical-looking piping and the door. The door had been left open a small crack, and it was obvious that someone had left through there in a hurry.
Genji, あの扉はどこに通じているのですか?
中庭です。
逃がすかよ、クソこの野郎。
Battler let out a war cry as he slammed into the door. Cool air from the outside suddenly rushed in. There were some thin, rough stairs leading up. Battler ran up them shouting, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this!" Natsuki was also rushing up the stairs, chasing after Battler. They were in the courtyard. The courtyard of the mansion had been built strictly for lighting purposes, so it wasn't a very elegant place. Because it was surrounded on all sides, the air was calm and completely undisturbed, even though they could hear the sound of strong winds. There was only the gentle, sorrowful rain. As he ran through the cold and scattered raindrops, dashing up the stairs into the courtyard, Battler looked in every direction. Of course, the odds of him finding a suspicious silhouette just standing around nonchalantly were pretty much zero. Battler spun, looking all around. He turned again and again. He kept spinning until he almost lost his sense of direction. He prayed that he would see the culprit somewhere in the scenery, but there was no chance. All he saw as he spun around was more and more of the mansion's heartless walls and windows. Furthermore, there were 2 entrances in the mansion from the courtyard, and neither of them were locked. Because the courtyard couldn't be entered from the outside the mansion, the doors had been built without locks. They didn't know which one they'd left through. He had to give up. Battler pounded the wall with his fist, swearing. Battler pressed his forehead against the wall, which he scratched out with his fingernails as he cried. Battler was a boy who could understand the feelings of pain and regret in a person's heart, so he cried, with all his strength. Natsuhi, who'd always thought of Battler as a frank person, was a little surprised to find he had this delicate side, and at the same time she understood how easily hurt the heart of a young person could be, so she held him. Battler, after sobbing into Natsuhi's chest for a while, wiped his tears with a bitter smile, as though he had been like that the whole time, and tried to appear as though he'd cried more than enough already. When the seagulls cry, the crime will be solved. Umineko no nakokoro ni. Roll credits. But for some reason, Battler felt a slight sense of uneasiness, as if the seagulls would never cry again. Now it couldn't be true. When the typhoon passes, surely the lively seagulls will return to the harbour again. I'm gonna leave it there for now. Yeah, nothing. It's Kanana's not dead. So, he lived. There was an attempt made on his life. They failed. But yeah. We've had fun with this one. We'll be back.